The finality of it was not in the judge's gavel or the lawyer's dry recitation of the will. It was in the sound of the front door to the Davies house closing behind Elara for the last time. The solid oak which her husband Thomas had hung himself clicked shut with a dead, hollow finality. On the porch she stood with nothing but the clothes on her back, a small canvas satchel containing a loaf of bread and a worn Bible, and the thick, mocking piece of parchment in her hand. Her father-in-law, Mr. Davies, had pressed it into her palm, not with sympathy, but with the cold efficiency of a man settling a debt. He had stood in the parlor, a pillar of righteous severity, his face framed by the dark wood and leather of a house she no longer belonged to. After Thomas's death and the silver mine collapse, the family had moved with the swiftness of circling vultures. A newer will had been discovered, one that left everything, the house, the savings, the shares in the mine, to his father and brother. Elara, the woman who had made it a home, was rendered a footnote. Her inheritance was a single, cruel joke, the deed to the Old North Quarry, a worthless plot of land Thomas had bought on a whim years ago, a place the whole valley knew as Davies's Folly. It was a collapsed scar on the face of the mountain, a pit of rubble and scree considered not just useless, but dangerous. Mr. Davies had also given her $20, 20 silver dollars, counted out, onto the polished mahogany table, each coin a small, cold insult. "This is more than generous," he had declared to the silent room, his voice leaving no room for argument. "It is enough for a ticket east to your people. There is nothing for you in Promise Creek now." His gaze was like iron, daring her to protest, to weep, to make a scene. She did none of those things. She simply met his eyes, her own a clear, still gray, and took the deed and the coins. His wife, a woman who had once called Elara daughter, looked at her hands, her face a mask of pained submission. Outside, the autumn wind had a sharp edge to it, a promise of the winter to come. It sliced through her thin shawl like a knife. The town of Promise Creek went about its business, the clang of the blacksmith's hammer and the rumble of a passing wagon, the only sounds that seemed to notice her existence. She stood on that porch for a long moment, the world she had known shrinking to the dimensions of the useless paper in her hand. Beside her, a low whine broke the silence. Buster, Thomas's old hound, nudged his wet nose into her palm, his brown eyes full of a sorrow that mirrored her own. Mr. Davies had tried to keep the dog, but Buster would have none of it. He had stayed glued to Elara's side since the funeral. He was all she had left of Thomas. Instead of walking to the stagecoach office, she walked to Gable's Mercantile. The bell above the door chimed, announcing her entrance. The scent of coffee beans, leather, and salted pork filled the air. Mr. Gable, a man whose face was a ledger of town gossip, stopped polishing the counter. He saw her satchel, the look on her face, and knew. His expression softened with a pity that was almost as sharp as Mr. Davies's cruelty. "Elara," he said, his voice low, "I heard. It's a hard thing, a wicked thing. The stage for Denver leaves at dawn. $20 will see you there with change to spare." She looked past him, her eyes scanning the shelves laden with goods. She saw the stacked sacks of flour, the barrels of nails, the gleaming heads of axes. She saw the things a person needed to build, not to flee. The town expected her to disappear. They expected her to break, to become a cautionary tale whispered over Sunday dinners. In that moment, standing in the warm, cluttered store, a different kind of fire kindled in her heart. It was not a hot, raging fire of anger, but a cold, dense flame of resolve. She would not be erased. "I'll not be needing a ticket, Mr. Gable," she said, her voice quiet but firm. She placed 12 of her $20 on the counter. "I need a good felling axe, the best one you have, a shovel, a sturdy one, 50 feet of rope, a small sack of nails, and a sharpening stone." Mr. Gable stared at the coins, then back at her. He saw the deed she still held clutched in her other hand. "Elara, child, what are you thinking? You can't—" You're not going up to the quarry. That place is a death trap. It's nothing but broken rock and wind." His voice was pleading, a genuine concern that almost broke through her composure. "This land is mine," she said, her voice unwavering. She tapped the parchment. "It's all I have. I will not be a charity case, and I will not run." She pushed the coins forward. "The axe, please, Mr. Gable." He looked at her for a long moment, saw the unbending will in her eyes, and finally, with a heavy sigh, turned to get the supplies. He wrapped them in a burlap sack, his movements slow and sad, as if he were packing for her funeral. As she shouldered the heavy load and turned to leave, Buster at her heels, he said one last thing. "The town won't let you starve, Elara. When you're ready to give up this foolishness, my door is open." She nodded, a silent acknowledgment of his kindness, but did not look back. She walked out of the store, away from the town, and toward the rising slope of the mountain, the weight of the tools, a strange and solid comfort, on her back. The journey to the North Quarry was a punishing ascent. The trail that led from Promise Creek dwindled from a wagon-rutted road to a deer track, and finally to nothing at all. The land grew steeper, the soil thinner, giving way to shale and granite bones that jutted from the earth. Elara leaned into the climb, the heavy sack digging into her shoulders. Each step was an effort of will. The air grew thin and cold, and the friendly sounds of the valley, the distant lowing of cattle, the chime of the church bell, faded, replaced by the lonely sigh of wind through pine and the scuttling of unseen things in the underbrush. Buster trotted ahead, then circled back, his tail low, but his presence a constant, silent encouragement. He was a creature of the mountains, and while he seemed to sense her sorrow, he was at home in this rugged, unforgiving world. For Elara, it was an alien landscape. She was a woman of hearth and home, of gardens and kitchens. This wilderness felt like an enemy, its jagged peaks and shadowed canyons watching her with a cold, indifferent gaze. The weight of her supplies was immense, a physical manifestation of the impossible task she had set for herself. Several times she had to stop, her lungs burning, her muscles screaming, and rest against a rock, the rough bark of a pine tree pressing into her back. After hours of climbing, she reached the shelf of land described in the deed, and she saw it. Her heart, which had been beating a steady rhythm of grim determination, sank into a cold pit of despair. The town's assessment had been an understatement. It was worse than useless. A great gaping wound had been torn from the mountainside, the result of a long-abandoned quarry operation. The cliff face was a sheer, weeping wall of dark stone, and at its base was a chaotic jumble of rock and earth. Boulders the size of wagons, piles of shattered slate, and a steep slope of loose scree that slid and shifted with every gust of wind. The opening to what might have once been a cave or mine entrance was completely buried under a massive rockfall. It wasn't a shelter, it was a grave. The wind howled across the exposed ledge, unimpeded and vicious. It clawed at her shawl, chilling her to the bone. There was no level ground, no soil, no water, nothing but stone and sky. Mr. Gable was right. Mr. Davies was right. The entire town was right. This was a place to die. She slid to the ground, the heavy sack falling from her numb shoulders. The resolve that had carried her from the town dissolved into a wave of utter hopelessness. Tears she had refused to shed in front of her father-in-law now burned hot in her eyes and froze on her cheeks. She buried her face in her hands, the rough wool of her mittens scratching her skin. It was over. She had traded the slow death of charity for the quick death of foolish pride. Buster whined, nudging his head insistently under her arm. He licked the tears from her face, his warm tongue a stark contrast to the biting cold. When she didn't respond, he began to pace anxiously, sniffing at the base of the rockfall. He stopped at a narrow gap between two colossal boulders, a space barely wide enough for him to squeeze through, and began to whine again, this time with a note of urgency. He looked back at her, barked once, a sharp, commanding sound, and then wriggled into the darkness. "Buster, no! Come back!" she cried, her voice thin against the wind. Fear, sharp and sudden, cut through her despair. The rockfall could shift. He could be crushed. Scrambling to her feet, she followed him, calling his name. She squeezed through the same tight gap, the rough stones scraping her coat. Inside, the roar of the wind was instantly muffled, replaced by a deep, resonant silence. The air was still, and it was not cold. It was cool, but distinctly, miraculously, not freezing. It carried a damp, earthy smell like a spring cellar. Her eyes adjusted to the gloom. She was in a small, protected space behind the main rockfall, and there she saw what the dog had found. From a dark fissure in the back wall of the quarry, a tiny, steady trickle of water wept from the stone, glinting in the faint light. It collected in a small, clear pool before disappearing into the rubble. She reached out a trembling hand and touched the rock around the fissure. It was cool, but not icy. The water itself was shockingly mild. It was a spring, a live spring, deep within the mountain. As she stood there, staring at the impossible drip of water, she felt something else. A faint, almost imperceptible current of air, moving not from the entrance, but upward, from another crack in the rock far above. It was a natural flue, a chimney. The despair that had gripped her moments before did not simply vanish. It was burned away by a sudden fierce surge of hope, so powerful it made her dizzy. The town saw a pile of worthless rock. They saw a tomb, but they were wrong. The rockfall that made the quarry useless was also a barrier, a shield against the wind. The mountain that looked like an enemy was offering a gift. This wasn't a grave, it was a foundation. This wasn't a death trap, it was a fortress. She knelt by the small pool, dipped her cupped hands into the water, and drank. It was the best water she had ever tasted. Buster lapped beside her, his tail giving a single, triumphant thump against the stone floor. She looked into the darkness of the cave at the mountain of rubble before her, and the scale of the work ahead seemed not daunting, but possible. She had stone, she had water, and she had a shelter from the wind. She had a chance. The work began the next morning. It was a labor of brutal, punishing simplicity. Her task was twofold: to clear the rubble choking the interior of the quarry, and to use that same rubble to build a wall across the entrance, sealing herself in. The first days were a blur of screaming muscles and raw, blistered hands. The stones were heavy, awkward, and unforgiving. She used a thick branch as a lever, her entire body straining to shift boulders that had sat unmoved for decades. Her hands, accustomed to needlework and kneading dough, were torn and bleeding within hours. She would work until exhaustion became a kind of numbness, then collapse onto her bed of pine boughs in the protected alcove. Buster curled against her for warmth, and sleep a dead, dreamless sleep. Slowly, painfully, a space began to clear. She worked with a methodical fury, not thinking about the weeks or months ahead, but only of the next stone. Move the stone, find its place, move the next. She started the foundation of her wall first, selecting the largest, flattest boulders and wedging them into a solid line across the quarry's mouth, leaving only a narrow opening for herself and Buster. It was a monumental game of balance and leverage, a puzzle with pieces that weighed hundreds of pounds. She learned the physics of stone by instinct, feeling for the center of gravity, using smaller rocks as shims and wedges. There were failures. A section of wall she had spent a day building collapsed overnight, a heartbreaking slide of stone and effort. She wept with frustration, but the next morning she started again, building it stronger this time. As she cleared the interior, the true shape of her shelter was revealed. It was not a simple cave, but a vast, high-ceilinged chamber, perhaps 50 feet deep and 30 feet wide, the back of which narrowed into the fissure that held the spring. One day, while digging near the damp back wall, her shovel hit something soft and yielding. It was not rock, but a thick, heavy deposit of gray clay. It was dense and smooth, perfect for mortar. This discovery was as vital as the spring. She mixed the clay with water and sand, creating a thick, sticky paste. She began to fill the gaps between the stones of her wall, chinking them against the wind. The crude mortar worked. It held. The wall grew, stone by stone, sealed with the very earth of the mountain. Her next great task was the fireplace. She identified the natural fissure she had felt drawing air, a crack that snaked up the cliff face. This would be her chimney. Against the back wall, she built a massive hearth from the smoothest, most fire-resistant stone she could find. It was slow, careful work. The keystone for the mantel was a slab of granite so heavy it took her 2 days to lever it into place. The day she finished it was a milestone. With trembling hands, she laid a small fire of dry sticks and pine cones in the hearth. She struck a precious match. The kindling caught, and with a soft whoosh, the smoke was drawn not into the cave, but straight up the fissure and out of sight. It worked. The fire crackled to life, its light dancing across the stone walls she had built. For the first time in weeks, she felt a profound, penetrating warmth. She sat before the flames, tears streaming down her face, not of sorrow, but of triumph. She was not just surviving, she was building. With the main wall half complete and a fire to keep the chill at bay, she knew she needed more. She needed a sustainable source of food. Leaving Buster to guard their nascent home, she made the long journey back down to Promise Creek. Her appearance caused a stir. She was thinner, her face weathered, her hands scarred and calloused. Her clothes were stained with dirt and clay. The whispers followed her as she walked to the mercantile. They were calling her the Quarry Queen now, a name dripping with mockery. Mr. Gable's face fell when he saw her. "Ilara, I was hoping you'd come to your senses." "I need supplies, Mr. Gable," she said, ignoring the pity in his eyes. She laid her remaining $8 on the counter. "Salt, a sack of oats, and I need to know who might sell me a pair of goats and some chickens, not for cash, for labor." He stared at her as if she had lost her mind. "Goats? Chickens? Up there? Child, what will you feed them? How will they survive the winter?" "I will manage," she said. "Do you know anyone?" He sighed, defeated by her sheer, inexplicable will. He directed her to a small farm on the edge of the valley, owned by an old man named Silas, who was known to be eccentric and kind. Silas listened to her request, his weathered face unreadable. He looked at her hands, saw the story of labor written in them, and nodded slowly. He would give her 2 milking goats, both pregnant, and a crate of 6 hens in exchange for her spending a week mending his fences and chopping his winter wood. She agreed without hesitation. For 7 days she worked for Silas, the familiar ache of the axe a welcome feeling. On the final day he helped her tie the goats and secure the crate for the journey up the mountain. "The valley folk think you're a fool," he said, his voice raspy. "I'm not so sure. A woman who works like you is rarely a fool." Leading the goats and carrying the chickens up the steep path was an ordeal, but the thought of fresh milk and eggs spurred her on. Back at the quarry she built a sturdy pen for the animals in a protected corner of the main chamber, far from the entrance, but close enough to the fire's radiant warmth. The sound of their gentle bleating and soft clucking filled the vast stone space, chasing away the oppressive silence. They were not just livestock, they were life. Her final, most ambitious project was the garden. The floor of the cave was bare stone. If she wanted to grow anything, she would need soil. So she began to haul it. Every other day she would take 2 canvas sacks down to the wooded valley below her quarry, fill them with rich, dark earth, and carry the heavy load back up the mountain. It was a Sisyphean task. Dozens of trips, hundreds of pounds of dirt, carried on her own back. In the deepest, warmest part of the cave, near the spring, she built low stone walls to create raised garden beds. She filled them with the precious soil, layer by layer. There, by the steady glow of a single lantern, in a place that had never known the sun, she planted seeds, potatoes, carrots, onions, and hardy winter greens. It was an act of audacious faith, a garden grown in the heart of a stone mountain. Buster would often lie at the edge of the lamplight, watching her tend the small patch of earth, a silent, furry guardian of her impossible dream. Mr. Davies chose a cold, gray afternoon in late autumn to ride up to the quarry. He came not out of concern, but out of a grim, self-satisfied certainty. He expected to find Alara huddled in some pathetic lean-to, broken and ready to beg for the mercy she had previously refused. He tethered his horse and walked to the edge of the rockfall, his boots crunching on the loose shale. What he saw stopped him cold. A solid wall of stone, already 8 feet high, now spanned the quarry entrance. It was a marvel of raw, stubborn labor, the gaps chinked with gray mortar. A thin, almost invisible wisp of smoke curled from a crack high up the cliff face. From within he could hear the faint bleating of a goat. Alara emerged from the opening she had left for a door, wiping her clay-stained hands on a piece of sacking. She was gaunt, but her eyes held a light he had never seen before. Not the soft glow of the young bride she had been, but the hard, bright glint of forged steel. She simply looked at him, waiting. "What is this madness?" he finally managed, his voice a low growl of disbelief. He gestured at the wall. "You're building your own tomb." "It's a house," she replied, her voice even. He scoffed, a harsh, grating sound. "A house of rock and mud, you and your folly. The whole town is laughing. They're calling you the cave girl now, digging in the dirt like an animal. This is what your pride has brought you to." He had come to see her fail, and instead he found this monument to her defiance. It infuriated him. "Winter will be here in a month. The first real snow will bury you. This wall will be your headstone." She did not rise to the bait. She simply held his gaze. "The wall will hold," she said. "I have shelter, Mr. Davies, and I have work to do." She turned and disappeared back into the darkness of her quarry, leaving him standing alone in the biting wind. He stared at the stone wall, at the impossible reality of it, a seed of unease planting itself in his heart. He rode back to Promise Creek and told everyone who would listen that his former daughter-in-law had gone mad, building a prison for herself on the mountain. The town laughed, and the name Widow's Folly stuck. As the days shortened and the last of the autumn leaves fell, deep winter began to lay its siege to the valley. The world outside Alara's stone fortress became a landscape of stark monochrome. Snow fell, first in gentle dustings, then in thick, heavy blankets that silenced the world. For the people in Promise Creek, it was the beginning of a long, cold confinement. For Alara, it was the beginning of a new rhythm, a life shrunk to the warm, ordered world she had carved from the mountain. Her days fell into a steady, comforting routine. She would wake before dawn in the deep, silent darkness, the only light the faint red glow of the embers in the hearth. Her first task was always the fire. She would add logs from the massive stockpile she had cut and hauled, the scent of burning pine filling the chamber. Then, by lantern light, she would tend to her animals. She milked the 2 goats, their warm milk hissing into the wooden bucket. She collected the precious eggs from the hens, each one a small, perfect miracle. The animals, safe and warm within the stone walls, were calm and productive, oblivious to the raging elements outside. After the animals were cared for, she would attend to her hidden garden. In the cool, damp air of the inner cave, under the constant glow of her oil lamp, green shoots had pushed through the dark soil. The sight of them, vibrant and alive in the dead of winter, was a daily reassurance. She watered them from the spring, her hands moving gently over the tender leaves. Her world was one of sensory richness, the warmth of the fire on her face, the earthy smell of the garden, the soft sound of the goats chewing their cud, the steady, rhythmic drip of the spring that was the mountain's own heartbeat. She was utterly alone, but she was not lonely. She was the sovereign of this stone kingdom, her life governed by the simple, profound necessities of heat, water, and life. Before the great blizzard settled in for good, her systems faced a smaller test. A pack of wolves, lean and desperate with hunger, descended from the high peaks. Drawn by the scent of the goats, they circled her fortress for 2 nights. Their howls echoed off the cliff face, a chilling chorus of wild hunger. In a wooden cabin, such a sound would have been terrifying. But inside her stone walls, it was distant, almost irrelevant. The massive mortared wall was impenetrable. Buster stood guard at the heavy wooden door she had built, his deep, rumbling growls a sufficient answer to the wolves' cries. On the 3rd day they were gone, having found no purchase, no weakness. The incident did not frighten her. It emboldened her. Her shelter was not just a home. It was a stronghold. The winter of '83 arrived not as a season, but as an invading army. It began with a snow that did not stop for 3 days and 3 nights, a relentless fall of white that buried the world. Then came the wind. It was a physical presence, a howling monster that clawed at the valley. It screamed down from the peaks, scouring the landscape, piling snow into drifts 20 feet high. It was a wind that could strip the bark from trees and find its way through the smallest chink in a log cabin, stealing warmth like a thief. It was a wind that killed. Inside Alara's stone fortress, the storm was a distant rumor. The roar of the wind was a muted bass rumble, the sound of a faraway ocean. Her wall, now 2 feet thick and sealed tight with clay, did not tremble. The tons of rock absorbed the wind's fury without a shudder. The mountain itself was her shield. The fire in her hearth drew perfectly, its smoke whisked away by the natural chimney, its heat radiating out into the main chamber. The massive stone walls, floor, and hearth acted as a thermal battery. They soaked up the heat from the fire and released it slowly, creating a deep, stable warmth that permeated the entire space. Even when the fire burned low at night, the cave never grew truly cold. The temperature hovered in a constant, comfortable range, a miracle of physics and geology. She was not fighting the storm. She was living outside its reach. While the world outside was a maelstrom of white chaos and lethal cold, her world was one of peace and order. The goats chewed their hay, the chickens roosted, and in the back of the cave, the green shoots in her garden grew steadily under the lamplight. The spring continued its steady drip, providing an endless supply of fresh, clean water that would never freeze. She had built more than a shelter. She had built an ecosystem, a pocket of resilience in a world that had turned hostile. In Promise Creek, it was a different story. The town's confidence, built on sturdy logs and a century of predictable winters, began to shatter. This storm was different. The sheer weight of the snow was immense. The roof of the livery stable was the first to go, collapsing with a sound like thunder, killing 6 horses. Then the porch of the mercantile buckled. Log cabins that had stood for 50 years began to groan under the load. Families huddled together, stuffing rags into the chinks in their walls as the wind stole their precious heat. Firewood, stockpiled for a normal winter, was being burned at an alarming rate. Worst of all, the pass, the town's only link to the outside world, was gone. An avalanche, triggered by the storm, had roared down the mountain, burying the road under 30 feet of snow and rock. The weekly supply train was not coming. There would be no more flour, no more salt, no more medicine, until the spring thaw. The town was an island, isolated and cut off. Panic, cold and sharp, began to set in. The laughter about the cave girl and widow's folly had long since died, replaced by a grim and growing fear. Their conventional wisdom, their sturdy wooden homes, their community, all were failing. They were trapped, and they were beginning to starve. The knock on her door, when it came, was not a knock. It was a frantic, desperate pounding, a sound nearly lost in the howl of the wind. Buster erupted into a frenzy of barking, the sound echoing in the stone chamber. Alara, who had been mending a tear in her coat by the fire, froze. No one ever came here. No one could. The path was buried. She grabbed a heavy piece of firewood as a club, her heart hammering against her ribs. "Who is it?" she called out. Her voice loud and steady, a voice hoarse and cracked, screamed back. "Alara, it's Jacob. For the love of God, open the door." Jacob, Thomas's younger brother, the one who had stood silently behind his father as she was cast out. She wrestled with the heavy bar that sealed the thick plank door and pulled it open just enough to see. A figure, caked in snow and ice, stumbled forward and collapsed into the entrance. It was Jacob, his face blue with cold, his beard frozen solid. She dragged him inside, away from the clawing wind, and barred the door again. The sudden warmth and quiet of the cave hit him like a physical blow. He lay on the stone floor, gasping, his eyes wide with shock and disbelief. "How?" he whispered, his gaze sweeping from the crackling fire to the penned animals, to the faint green glow of the garden in the back. "How is this possible?" "Never mind that," she said, her voice clipped. She knelt and began to brush the snow from his coat. "What are you doing out in this? You could have died." His eyes filled with tears, which froze instantly on his icy cheeks. "It's Lily," he choked out, the name of his 4-year-old daughter. "She has the lung fever. The house, it's so cold. We burned the last of the wood yesterday. We burned a chair. My wife is trying to keep her warm with her own body, but it's not enough. She's fading, Alara." He grabbed her arm, his grip surprisingly strong. "Father, he is too proud. But I remembered what he said. About your wall, about this place. I thought, maybe you survived." Alara stood up and looked from the desperate man on her floor to the orderly, warm world she had built. She looked at her woodpile stacked neat and high, enough for 2 more months if she was careful. She looked at her shelves lined with jars of preserved berries and dried meat with sacks of oats. She thought of Mr. Davies's cold pronouncement in the parlor. She thought of the mocking nickname, "Widow's Folly." A bitter, cold anger coiled in her gut. They had left her to die. Now they came to her for life. It would be justice to turn him away, to let them face the consequences of their own cruelty. But then she saw the face of little Lily in her mind, a child she had once bounced on her knee. She saw the desperation in Jacob's eyes, the sheer animal terror of a father about to lose his child. Her own carefully rationed survival was one thing. But could she listen to the howl of the wind and know that a child was dying of cold, all for the sake of her pride? The choice was not a choice at all. Her own hardship had not made her hard. It had scoured her down to the bedrock of her character, and that bedrock was compassion. "Get up," she said, her voice leaving no room for argument. "Sit by the fire." She strode to the back of the cave and returned with a sled she had fashioned from smooth planks of pine. Without a word she began to load it. She piled it high with logs from her precious woodpile. She added 2 thick wool blankets she had woven herself. She went to her larder and took down jars of goat's milk, a slab of smoked venison, and a small sack of potatoes from her subterranean garden. Jacob watched her, his face a mask of stunned, shameful gratitude. When the sled was loaded, she pulled on her heaviest coat and wrapped a scarf around her face. "Let's go," she said. "Buster will lead. Stay close behind me." She opened the door, and together they plunged back into the white hell of the storm to save the family that had abandoned her. Entering the Davies house was like stepping into a crypt. The air was frigid and still, the silence broken only by the rattling wheeze of a sick child. The grand parlor, once a symbol of warmth and prosperity, was a landscape of frost. Ice crawled up the inside of the window panes. Mr. Davies, his wife, and their daughter-in-law were huddled in a single bedroom, wrapped in every blanket they owned. They were pale, their movements slow, their faces etched with a mixture of hunger, cold, and despair. On the bed, under a mountain of quilts, lay little Lily, her breathing shallow, her small face flushed with fever. When Ilara entered the room, pulling the sled behind her, they all stared as if seeing a ghost. Mr. Davis's face, already gray with cold, seemed to collapse. He saw Ilara alive and strong. He saw the firewood, the blankets, the food. He saw the embodiment of his own monumental, catastrophic failure of judgment and cruelty. His pride, the iron core of his being, shattered into 1,000 pieces. He tried to speak, but only a dry, rasping sound came out. Ilara ignored him. Her focus was entirely practical. "Jacob, get a fire going. Now," she commanded, her voice cutting through the frozen inertia of the room. "Use this wood. It's dry pine. It will catch fast." She moved to the bedside and laid a hand on Lily's forehead. The child was burning up. "Heat the milk. Add a little water to it. We need to get fluid and warmth into her." Her presence transformed the room. Where there had been despair, there was now purpose. Jacob, galvanized, hurried to the fireplace, his hands shaking as he laid the logs. His wife rushed to the kitchen to heat the milk on their small, sputtering camp stove. Ilara unwrapped Lily from the cold, damp blankets and rewrapped her in the thick, dry wool she had brought. The small body was terrifyingly limp. Mr. Davies stood by the wall, watching her. He watched this woman, whom he had dispossessed and cast out, move with calm authority, bringing life back into his dying house. He watched her save his granddaughter. The weight of his shame was a physical thing, pressing down on him, making it hard to breathe. When the fire finally caught, its light and warmth spreading through the room, he found his voice. It was a choked whisper, raw with a humility he had never known. "Ilara," he said. The single word was a confession, an apology, a plea. She finally turned to look at him, her gray eyes clear and unreadable. He could not meet her gaze. He looked at the floor. "We were wrong," he said, the words torn from him. "We called you a fool. We left you with nothing. My God, we were the fools." A lesser person might have savored the moment. They might have reminded him of his words, of his cruelty, of the closed door. Ilara did not. Her victory was not in his humiliation, but in the crackle of the fire, in the warmth spreading through the room, in the small child who was beginning to stir in her dry blankets. Her grace was her greatest strength, more formidable than any stone wall. She simply nodded once, a gesture of acknowledgment, not forgiveness. That would come later, or not at all. "The child needs broth," she said, turning her back on him. "I brought potatoes and venison. There is work to do." Word of what had happened spread through the frozen town with impossible speed. Jacob, filled with a zealous, grateful energy, told his neighbors. The woman they had mocked, the cave girl, was alive. Not just alive. She was warm. She had food. The next day, 2 more families, their own supplies exhausted, made the desperate trek up to the Widow's Folly. They arrived half-frozen, expecting to beg for scraps from a madwoman. Instead, they were led into a place of impossible warmth and plenty. Their eyes widened as they took in the scene, the huge, steady fire, the calm animals in their clean pens, the rows of preserved food on sturdy shelves, and, most shocking of all, the sight of a green, living garden deep within the mountain. They stared at the carrots and onions, their leaves vibrant under the lantern glow, as if they were looking at a mirage. They could not reconcile this organized, thriving homestead with the narrative of the foolish widow in a hole. Ilara greeted them, her face stern but not unkind, and gave them what she could spare, a sack of potatoes for one, a bundle of firewood for another, a jar of milk for a family with a baby. She took nothing in return. She asked for nothing. She simply provided. The road to the North Quarry became a lifeline. Each day brought new visitors, their faces a mixture of desperation and awe. Ilara's home, once a symbol of folly, became the heart of the valley's survival. Her stone cache was not just a pile of rocks, it was a larder, a woodshed, a dairy, and a garden. It was hope, built from discarded things and unbreakable will. When the spring thaw finally came 6 weeks later, and the supply wagons from Denver could at last break through the pass, they found a valley transformed. Promise Creek had been humbled, brought to its knees by the white winter of '83. But it had not been broken. It had survived thanks to the woman it had cast out. The immediate aftermath was a quiet revolution. The name Widow's Folly was never spoken again. Some started calling her home Stoneheart, a name that captured both the material of her house and the nature of her strength. Others simply called it the Shelter. Mr. Davies, a changed man, went before the town council. He publicly confessed his actions and signed a new deed, granting Ilara the quarry and the 50 acres surrounding it, free and clear. He also gave her a full third of the Davies family's remaining capital, not as charity, but as restitution. She accepted it quietly, using the money not for herself, but to purchase a larger stock of seeds, better tools, and 2 dairy cows. She established a community storehouse at the base of the mountain, ensuring that Promise Creek would never be so vulnerable again. The mockery she had endured was replaced by a deep, abiding respect that was worth more than any inheritance. Her story and her methods began to spread. Travelers passing through the valley heard the tale of the woman who built a fortress of warmth in the heart of a frozen mountain. Farmers and ranchers came to her, not with pity, but with questions. They studied her design. New barns began to be built with deep stone foundations and thick insulated walls. People learned the principles of thermal mass, of natural ventilation, of sheltering livestock from the worst of the wind. The very architecture of the valley began to change, incorporating the hard-won wisdom that Ilara had discovered through necessity. Her home became a landmark, a testament to the idea that what is discarded can hold the greatest value, and that true wealth is not in what you own, but in what you can build and what you can endure. Years later, Ilara would sit on the stone bench she had built at the entrance to her home, Buster's gray-muzzled descendant sleeping at her feet. She would watch the sunset paint the peaks in hues of orange and purple and feel a profound sense of peace. The valley below was prosperous again, its lights twinkling on in the dusk. She was no longer an outcast, but a pillar of her community, a quiet matriarch sought for her wisdom and her steady calm. She had been given nothing but a pile of rocks and the town's scorn. From it, she had not just built a shelter against the storm, she had built a life, a legacy, and a future, proving that the strongest foundations are not made of wood or wealth, but of an unbreakable will and a heart that refuses to become as cold as the world outside. If this story reminded you of the power of quiet resilience, share it with someone who believes in building something beautiful from what others have thrown away. And follow for more stories of courage, survival, and the enduring strength of the human spirit.